The German scouts can hardly believe their luck and their eyes, because there in front of them is an entire American armored division. They can see the tanks massed under the trees, hundreds of them. They can hear the roar of engines and the clank of treads and the shouted orders drifting across the fields. Their radios pick up the chatter of the unit's operators, exactly the traffic a division like this would produce. Everything an army uses to know where its enemy is tells them that a powerful force is gathered right here, and that the blow is going to fall right here. And every single piece of it is a lie. The tanks are made of rubber and air, the engine noise is a recording, the radio traffic is theater, performed by men impersonating soldiers who are somewhere else entirely. There is no division here at all. There is only a small band of Americans putting on the most elaborate and dangerous performance of the war. It is one of the strangest ideas any army has ever had, and it worked again and again. The concept was simple to state and take. A unit whose only weapon was deception, whose job was not to fight the enemy, but to fool him, to make him see armies that were not there and miss the ones that were. No heavy guns of their own, no real tanks. Their arsenal was rubber and sound and radio and pure nerve, and they took it into the middle of the deadliest war in nerve, and used it move the enemy known, like pieced, to move the enemy around like pieces on a board. And it was not a game. The whole point of the illusion was to draw the enemy's attention, and often his fire, toward the fake force and away from the real one, so that the actual attack could land somewhere the Germans were not looking. That meant these men deliberately made themselves conspicuous, deliberately invited a powerful enemy to come and destroy them, while armed with almost nothing that could shoot back. They were bait, on purpose, over and over, and the lives their trickery saved were real lives, thousands of them, belonging to the ordinary soldiers who attacked where the enemy had been fooled into leaving the door open. They were the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, and history remembers them by the name that fit them perfectly, the Ghost Army. Everything about them is documented now, in the Army's own declassified records, in the accounts the men were finally allowed to give. But for 50 years, almost no one knew they had ever existed. For 50 they did was so sigil. They did so secret that the men who did it for half a century to tell a living soul. Before we go further, if stories like this one matter to you, please take a moment to subscribe. It genuinely helps us keep the memory of these men alive and reach more people who care about them. Thank you. Now back to the ghosts and to how a handful of men conjured whole armies out of rubber and sound. Their tools were extraordinary. They had inflatable tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces, dummies that from a distance, or from the air, looked exactly like the real thing, which a few men could set up in a field to impersonate an armored division. They had sonic deception, recordings of tanks and troops and construction, played through enormous speakers so powerful the sound carried for miles, so the enemy would hear an army assembling in the dark. They had radio operators trained to mimic the exact style of specific real units, so that enemy listeners would track a division that was actually nowhere near. And they had sheer performance, men who would put on another unit's patches and drive through towns, pretending to be soldiers of a division that was really 100 miles away. And here is the detail that makes them unforgettable. Many of these men were artists. The army had gone looking for people with exactly the kind of eye the job required, and had recruited heavily from art schools. So the ranks of the Ghost Army were full of painters, designers, and illustrators, young men who would go on, after the war, to become famous names in American art and fashion. They were creative people, and they were handed the strangest creative assignment imaginable: to design and stage convincing illusions at life size in the middle of a war, with real enemy soldiers as their audience and thousands of lives riding on whether the show was good enough. Art, in their hands, quite literally became a weapon. Over the year after the Normandy landings, the Ghost Army ran roughly 24 separate deceptions across France, Luxembourg, and Germany, and they refined the craft into something close to an art form. The sonic team studied the exact sounds real units made, recorded them onto cutting-edge equipment, and then mixed them live, like a film score, so that a listening enemy would hear a bridge being built, or armor gathering, or infantry digging in, complete and convincing, drifting out of a field where a few dozen men stood beside some loudspeakers. It was theater staged for an audience that was never meant to know it was watching a show, and whose applause, if the show failed, would arrive in the form of artillery. It would be a mistake to imagine any of this was safe. The Ghost Army worked close to the front, sometimes dangerously close, and their entire purpose required them to attract the attention of a powerful and capable enemy. The Germans they were fooling were not fools. They were a serious army reacting sensibly to convincing evidence, and if that army decided to attack the impressive force it thought it saw, the handful of lightly armed men behind the illusion would be in mortal danger. The ghosts lived with that knowledge constantly, staging their performances, and then hoping the enemy would be deterred rather than provoked. And there were close calls, and there were casualties. Nerve was as much a part of their equipment as rubber and wire. Their masterwork came near the end. In March 1945, as the Allies prepared to cross the Rhine into the heart of Germany, the Ghost Army staged its largest deception, impersonating two entire divisions well away from the true crossing point, drawing German attention and defenses toward the illusion so that the real assault could go in where the enemy was weaker. It was a huge and intricate performance, rubber and sound and radio and impersonation all working together, and it helped pull the German defenders in the wrong direction at the decisive moment. The soldiers who made the actual crossing and lived largely never knew that a small band of artists in rubber tank country had helped clear their way. One of their most dangerous performances came in the autumn of 1944 in Luxembourg, where the Ghost Army was ordered to impersonate an armored division and plug a gap in the line that the real army could not yet fill. For days, a thin band of men with rubber tanks and loudspeakers stood in for thousands of soldiers, holding a hole in the front by illusion alone, knowing that if the Germans saw through it and attacked, there was almost nothing there to stop them. The bluff held, and the real forces arrived in time. But the men who ran it never forgot how naked they had been, betting their lives for days that the enemy would keep believing the show, and then they were sworn to silence. The methods of the Ghost Army were considered so valuable and so potentially useful in future wars that the entire operation was classified and kept that way for decades. The men went home from the war, having done something genuinely astonishing, having saved thousands of lives with imagination and courage, and they were told they could never speak of it. So they didn't. For 50 years, one of the most original units in the history of the US Army simply did not exist, as far as the public record was concerned, and the men carried the whole strange, brilliant story privately, unable to explain to anyone what they had actually done in the war. They scattered into remarkable lives. The artists among them became some of the defining names in post-war American culture, in painting, in fashion, in photography, celebrated for their creative work while the strangest creative work of their lives stayed locked away, unmentionable. They lived a quiet double life, ordinary famous men who happened to have once conjured armies out of air to fool the Wehrmacht, and who could not tell a soul. Only in the 1990s, when the unit was finally declassified, could the ghosts begin, at last, to speak. For some of them, the silence became its own quiet burden. They came home to families who assumed they had spent the war doing something ordinary, and they could not correct the impression. Men who had helped fool an entire army, who had stood in harm's way with nothing but nerve and rubber, let their relatives believe they had done nothing much at all, because the alternative was to break an oath they took seriously. Some carried that gap between the truth and what they were allowed to say for the rest of their lives, and a few died before the 50 years were up, having never once been able to tell the people they loved what they'd really done in the war. The recognition came slowly and late, but it came. As the story emerged through the surviving men and the researchers who documented them, the country began to understand what this odd little unit had actually accomplished, and in time the Ghost Army was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest honor the Congress can give, decades after the war and after most of its members were gone. The men who had spent their lives forbidden to explain themselves were finally honored in public for the illusions that had saved so many real lives. It is worth sitting with how unusual their courage was. We know what battlefield bravery looks like: the charge, the last stand, the gun held past the point of hope. The ghosts were brave in a way the war had almost no other place for. They stood, lightly armed and deliberately exposed, and invited a deadly enemy to come and find them, and their only defense was that the show was convincing enough. They fought with paint and rubber and recorded sound and steady nerves, and they won, over and over, without most of the men they saved ever knowing they were there. An army of artists imagined a way to save lives that had never existed before, staged it in the face of real death, and then kept the secret for 50 years. They deserve to be remembered at last, out loud.